Going to have another short lesson on brushes today, and this is more about the cleaning and use of them. So when we fill our water, make sure that you're filling it with cold water. You're not going to be putting your hands in there, so you might as well put cold water in there. When you go to wash your brush, I usually, myself, use a little bit of soap. I squirt out a little soap on my hand. I act as though I am loading the brush with paint, and that gets the soap up into the bristles, and then I'll use my fingers like a washboard and rub it back and forth to get that soap to go up inside the ferrule. And then when you go to wash this out at the sink, make sure that you're using cool to lukewarm water, because inside of here is some adhesive that holds the bristles to the handle, and if you're using really hot water, that can soften the adhesive and your bristles may fall out. So keep that in mind. Now, one thing you don't want to do is, as you're painting, set your brush in a bucket of water and let it sit there. There's a couple of reasons for that. If your water is very deep, it could be up here into the handle, and it could start to destroy and warp or make it very uncomfortable basically to hold, because it'll make the paint come off and it'll start destroying the wood underneath. Secondly, when you put an object with these kind of bristles inside a bowl that's got a nice rounded edge, what you're going to end up doing is, if that thing sits in there for a while, it's going to be it's putting pressure on those bristles, and it'll end up putting a warp into your bristles. It'll have that little hook shape at the end. And I know this to be true because I've actually had brushes that ended up with a little hook on the end of them. So here's the other thing that you don't want to do. You don't want to set your brush on the edge of your palette and let it rest like this either, because there's still an angle going on here. And we don't want to disrupt the natural flexibility and flatness of your brush. So you're going to lay it down flat instead. Now, I see a lot of people who will set their brushes down on the table like this, and here's two things. They'll either do it on the table or they'll put the brush on a paper towel. Now, both of these things are going to draw the moisture out of the brush, which is what you don't want. So a surface like this is enameled metal. You can use plastic. You could use a plastic tablecloth to cover your surface, and then that way when you set your brushes down, it helps hold the moisture inside the bristles. Keeps moist bristles a lot longer than on paper towel, which will draw it out. The reason we want to do that is because we may not have cleaned it completely. Just swishing it out in the water, going back and forth in the water like that, does not get all the paint out of the brush. So when we set it down in between using that brush, maybe we'll set that one aside and start using this one. This one is beginning to dry, and if there are any paint pigments left inside those bristles, they will begin to dry too, and what you'll end up with are brushes that look more like this. So you can see how on this brush it's beginning to fray out. It's no longer tight like this bristle is. Very nice straight bristles on this one. This one's all frayed out, and it's because the paint got dried up inside here in the ferrule, which pushes those bristles out. Now that one's fairly mild. This one is pretty extreme. This was a flat brush at one time, and you can see that there's discoloration around the ferrule inside the bristles, and that is because the paint didn't get cleaned out of it properly, or it sat too long with paint on it. And when you're in the middle of painting, you're kind of rushing around a little bit, and you're moving from one brush to another perhaps, and sometimes it just happens. But this has happened repeatedly over time, and over time this is what happens to your bristles as they get all fanned out like this, and they're not going to hold a shape. In fact, it's very, very thick and dense down here at the base of that, and you can see even if I pinch it, I can't make it go flat again. It's just got too much dried paint up inside of here. So a couple of things to avoid that. First of all, never set your brush down when it has paint left in it. Make sure you're always swishing it out. Now, one of the things I teach my students also is to have an extra board. And this is just a real simple, this one's been around for a while. You can see it's even starting to discolor around the edges. I keep an extra board around, and I'll offload the paint that's on the brush currently. If I don't want to use that color anymore, or I don't want to use the brush anymore, I will offload the paint onto another board. And many, many times these boards become the base for a painting, and I'll get to showing you that later. But this is what I would call an offloading board. So I would just simply remove all the paint that I can off of the brush before I go into the water. Then I would wash it off the very best that I can. And one of the ways you can tell if you've got all the paint out is once you think you've got it cleaned out, go to your paper towel and just do a little swipe with it, and you'll see color on your paper towel if this isn't cleaned out. And then in that case, go back into the water, clean it again really nice, and then I just kind of squeegee the side like this, squeegee that brush so that there's moisture in it, but it's not dripping. And then you'll set it down on your surface, preferably something plastic or that does not draw the moisture out of your brush. When you are completely done with your painting session, that's when you're going to go put the soap on your hands, make sure you got that paint all cleaned out of there, and then it's preferred to dry your brushes laying flat. And I know that many people have things like this where they'll have a nice container, even maybe a cup or something like that, and they'll shove all their brushes in it like this. And when it's nice and full, it works pretty well, but not for drying. For drying, you want to lay them flat. Make sure they're completely dry before you put them in something like this, because what will happen is all of that moisture, if it's up in the air, all of the moisture runs from the tip of the brush down into the ferrule. And that's one of the reasons why this happens. It wasn't completely cleaned. It was set up like this. All that moisture ran down inside of the ferrule. Those pigments got caught in there and then dried, and they dry very hard. And that can be solved simply by drying the brushes flat and then putting them into a container like this instead of straight from washing into the container. The other thing I want to say about these containers, now this one, all the brushes are somewhat the same height, and they're in there pretty tightly. I can get my finger in there. There is a little bit of extra space, but the fact that it's so full is what keeps the brushes from hitting up against each other. Because one thing we don't want is let's say if I took out half of these brushes, now they're just all kind of leaning, and it's potential that one could lean against another. And so what you'll end up with is, I think, is it this one? No, this one. This would be a great example to show you. This particular brush has a bend in it, and I think I'm going to just try to swirl it around in my fingers so that you can see that it clearly has a bend. It's kind of warped off to one side. There's two reasons why that happens. One is because it's inside one of these, and it gets to leaning. It'll lean on another brush, and then that is just like leaving it in the water. And it's more likely to happen when you're in a bucket like this because you don't get to them as often, let's say. And so they get the bend just like they would if they were in the water or sitting on an angle that pushes the bristles in a particular direction, and you get a little hook on them. And the other way, leaving it in the water, putting it in one of these is going to lead to brushes that look like this and that look like this. So they're both a little bit disruptive. Now, the round brushes then become very difficult to use. The more the hook is pronounced, the worse it is, and I will just literally throw them away when they get that bad. This one, though, on the other hand, this one becomes a useful tool because you can see the bristles are so spread out, and this brush becomes a really good tool for using the dry brush technique or stippling. And so I do not throw these out because each one will have its own unique flair to it. So you can see how this brush is less flared than this brush. So this brush, I'll get a different kind of a stroke out of it. We'll talk about that again on another day. But that's the basics of caring for your brushes. We want them to last as long as we can because they are expensive and we don't want to be replacing them every couple of weeks. So proper brush care will make sure that they last much longer for you.